Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the very first installment in 2024 of Sotterley Presents People and Perspectives. My name is Nancy Easterling, and it is my honor to serve as the Executive Director of Historic Sotterley. We're glad you're joining us tonight. This is not only the kickoff event for our speaker series, but it is also the first of our Common Ground events this year, a place that we come together to understand the past, understand ourselves, understand different cultures, to understand the world we have now, and to move forward to a better future together. So a few housekeeping notes today. If you have any questions, you don't need to save them till the end. You can put them in the Q&A section of the chat at any time. We would love if you would sign into the chat. Tell us who's joining us tonight. Tell us where you're joining us from. I understand we're going to have some Pittsburgh people joining us tonight, and we're really excited about that. I wanted to tell you that as soon as I met her last year, I knew we had to have her tonight as our speaker. Caitlyn was on an incredible panel that we did down at St. Mary's College last last fall. And just the way that you thought, the way that you have examined the past, I just knew that this book, which, yes, I've read, and hopefully you all have too, and if you haven't, you're going to be, I knew it was going to be amazing. And so we are so happy tonight to welcome Caitlyn Hunter with us. Let me just give you a quick introduction, Caitlyn. She was the inaugural Black emerging artist in residence at Chatham University in 21 and 22. That's really impressive, I just have to say. She's a doctoral candidate at Duquesne University, where she researches African-American literature and Black food studies. She is currently writing both a collection of short stories and a culinary memoir around her maternal ancestry. Her first book, Power in the Tongue, debuted in 2022. Her work appears in Midnight and Indigo, Lost Balloon, and elsewhere. She's currently an assistant professor of English at the College of Southern Maryland. Caitlyn, we are so excited for you to come and share this really important work that mixes oral histories with your traditional historical memories. And I'm just so excited for you to share this with us tonight. So I pass it on to you. I give to you, Caitlyn Hunter.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's such an honor to be here. I want to say thank you to Christina and Catherine as well, and Sotterley. I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so honored to be with all of you and in conversation with you this evening. When I think about what makes a good narrative, I was taught that there's a situation in a story. The situation is the what, and the story being the how of what makes a narrative so great. And so tonight I'm going to read alongside with you. I'm also going to talk about genre and myth as a way of showing how I came to write such an important narrative, not necessarily for myself, but for my family and so many Black lived experiences. So without further ado, I will start this presentation. I have to go back a few slides. Sorry there. We were doing a test run. All right, just bear with me. All right, there we go. So this is taken from a previous craft talk that I've done. It's called Writing Truth into Fable, and thinking about how creative nonfiction and myth and folklore can intertwine. Fokuro fun umanira. There was a time long ago when African people could fly. They had magic. It was old magic, where they could sing and turn into birds and soar high above the trees. But their enemies had nets. When they were captured and brought across the sea, their captors clipped their wings, sold their jewelry, and instead gave them shackles. As they toiled in new lands under the blazing southern sun, they kept their songs, but the language grew bitter and distorted on their tongues. Even so, they still had the same melody and rhythm lodged within their throats. As the crack of the whips lashed across their backs, they still stretched their arms to the skies. But the lift felt unfamiliar, and so they coped with this newfound grounding. One day, an enslaved woman laid an egg, and from this egg emerged a magpie. He was born with blue eyes, and out of fear of losing, like she had so many with her other children, the woman decided to never give the child a proper name. Master loved his magpie. Their eyes were the same cloudy milk blue. The way a magpie's black feathers shone, like onyx radiating hints of purple in the sun, was mystical. Every day, Master would open the cage, stroke his feathers, and wait for his bird to serenade him. And perched high on the windows, Magpie would sing for Master. Yak, 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 the bird would begin. My master's back. Today the tobacco will grow high. Yak, yak, yak. There's talk of a Union attack. Slavery's end is nigh. Slavery's end, chuckled Master. Silly bird. The South will never go for it. We may be losing, but the war is far from over. Master patted Magpie's head and locked the cage. 2 days later, the war ended and Master's slaves were free. Master couldn't lose his beloved bird, so he and Magpie made a deal. Stay with me, sweet Magpie. If you do, I'll release you from this cage, and you can roam all about my land as you see fit. Master offered his hand, and Magpie shook it. After all, where would he go? That night, while Magpie was sleeping, Master put a shackle with a long ball and chain on Magpie's foot. When Magpie awoke the next morning, he realized that he was still out of the cage, but unable to shuffle any further than the veranda. Years passed and Magpie grew, but he was still awfully lonely. One day, Magpie sat on the front porch crying when a young girl walked by and offered him a tissue. Pretty bird, she cooed. Why are you crying? Yak, yak, yak. Oh, woe is me. Master has betrayed me. Yak, yak, yak. I should be free, but now I'm chained to misery. Oh, poor darling, the girl gasped and kissed Magpie on the forehead. There, it's all right now. The girl reached into her apron and handed Magpie some cornbread wrapped in cloth. Magpie gobbled it up. It was the sweetest, softest bread he ever tasted. My name's Nellie, the girl said. She dusted herself off and grabbed the basket of laundry, hoisting it on her hip. Be seeing you. With that, she walked away. Magpie was in love, and he molted with the longing. With every wilting feather, Master saw an opportunity growing. Hey, Magpie, Master coyly asked. I know I tricked you, but hear me out. If I give you a plot of land and you promise to stay, I'll let you marry that girl. Yak, yak, yak. I'll shake on that. Yak, yak, yak. She makes me so happy. Yak, yak, yak. I'll stay and work. Yak, yak, yak. I'll be free with Nellie. And with that, Magpie and Master shook hands, and soon after, Magpie and Nellie were married. But the land Master gave Magpie was rotten. Nothing grew. Nothing lived. Magpie and Nellie now had children in a little shack high on the hill. Magpie and Nellie toiled and tilled dry plots of dirt where not even tobacco could be bothered to grow. Work got to be so hard that Nellie's brothers had to help, but even then, all they could reap was dying weeds and dust. When harvest time came, Master asked Magpie what he had to sell. Yak, yak, yak. My crops I lack. There's nothing here to sell. Yak, yak, yak. We broke our backs. There's nothing here to till. Now, Magpie, Master said, shaking his head, I expected better from you. I gave you a plot of land. Looks like you owe me more, and I'll just add it to your debt. Magpie Master shook hands, And Magpie went home to his wife and children. Yak, 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 that master's a crook. We'll die here if we stay. Yak, 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 there is no food. I'll find work. I'll always find a way. Nellie agreed and packed her husband a bag. She put some chicken, some cornbread, and some salt pork in cloth and handed it to Magpie. She kissed him on the beak and wished him luck. Magpie kissed his family goodbye, lifted his arms, and flew. He flew from town to town looking for work. First, a town outside Chatham, Virginia, then Maryland, then Pennsylvania. Each farm offered a little more money than the next, and whatever he earned, Magpie sent to Nellie and the children. One day, as he was flying around, a large cloud of black fog made him cough and blinded his eyes. A gust of cold wind stiffened his wings, and before Magpie knew it, he hit a brick smokestack. Magpie rubbed his eyes and saw a sign, "Steel mill workers for hire." He followed the men towards the factory and stood in the soot-covered crowd. A man with a hard hat came out. "All right, fellas, we're looking for 20 men. Who here can work?" All the men raised their hands high in the air. Magpie did the same. One by one, people in the crowd were chosen. 1, 2, 3, 4. Magpie jumped a little higher. 5, 6, 7, 8. No, not you. How about the Italian over there? Magpie spread his wings, letting the air around him hoist him higher as the choosing went on. 17, 18, 19. Hey, you, the bird with the blue eyes. Magpie pointed to himself. Yeah, guy, you, come on, you're hired. As Magpie jumped down and shuffled his way through the crowd, the foreman concluded. Okay, guys, that's it. Come back tomorrow to see if we need replacements. The men in the crowd grumbled. The 20 selected men made their way to the front. The men gave their names to the foreman, and he gave them each a ticket. Magpie looked at the ticket in his hand and took one last look at the sky. He didn't need to fly anymore. Up north, there was opportunity. Up north, he could be his own master. In Pittsburgh, Magpie decided he and his family would roost. So, growing up, I was always into myths, fairy tales, and fables. There was something about the element of the crux between religion, the fantastical, and the supernatural that was so intoxicating. I grew up reading abridged Greek mythology, dreaming of badass heroines and minotaurs and gorgons. But then my mother got me a book called The People Who Could Fly. It was a book where the heroes of the story weren't white. Juxtaposed with Ariel and the Little Mermaid, I saw my first mermaid that was black. And to think now that we have a new black mermaid, and that's controversial, I have to wonder how many other stories, fables, and tales could, in fact, be black too. I'm really interested in the idea of folktale in terms of it being its own form of living document. We all have different ideas of what we define as document, right? Like for some, it's photographs. It could be the archive of your old Instagram or Snapchat stories. It could be that cute selfie that you saved on your phone for a later date, or holiday cards from your mom or your grandparents. It could be ticket stubs or favorite movies and concerts that you've gone to. But in short, document is just something that we attribute to capturing a moment. And however you do that and define it is your prerogative. For me as an artist, my creative work is my document. It's my attempt to archive facets of my life that I deem important. Through thinking of the document as this intentional art form, I've learned that preservation has a purpose. Each type of document we explore are simply breadcrumbs leading us back to historical grounding. As a kid, My grandfather used to show me this piece of paper here on the left. The way he would talk about it was he was talking about this far off land. And to be fair, he was living in Phoenix, Arizona, so Virginia was by no means close. But I understand why this plot of land was so important to him. And as I got older, the pieces of the puzzle of why this was important slowly came together. What's important here to note is the land surrounding the plot that my family owns. And if you can see here, it's a small estate that says Clem Coles Estate. The reason why it's important to know is because of this man, Walter Coles. He's a relative of James Madison's wife, and he was friends to Thomas Jefferson, and he was a Virginia planter. He was the politician who served in the Virginia House of Delegates and the U.S. House of Representatives. After the War of 1812, he lost both his father, Isaac Coles, and his elder half-brother. And because of those deaths, he inherited 9 slaves in 1,240 acres of land in Pittsylvania County, Virginia. Walter Coles established this home he called Coles Hill on that inherited land and built some handsome brick residences in a popular Georgian style. The federal census right before his death, after making provisions for his children, it stated that he owned roughly about 20 enslaved people, whereas another Coles owned about 96 enslaved people of the same name. The reason why I show this is because here is an appraisal list that was created a year after Walter Coles' death. On this list is a list of 95 enslaved people at Coles Hill. 2 of the names highlighted are my ancestors. My great-great-great-grandfather, Divis Coles, the highlighted one above, was appraised for $350. His son, Wilson, who was registered as mulatto, was sold for or appraised for $1,000. My great-great-grandfather, Clem, another son of Divis, and Divis's wife, Gilly, a cook enslaved at Coles Hill, are not listed at all. And if you look a little more closely at the census, you'll see that Clem was born before Divis and Gilly were married. These gaps insinuate a larger story. One that might explain why Clem ended up with this plot of land that formerly had belonged to his mother, where she got tricked out of the land, and Clem fought and scraped and sold tobacco to buy the land back. This is the same land that would go to his son Jesse, who would eventually move to Pittsburgh, pursuing economic opportunity, and then to Jesse's last surviving son, Archie, my grandfather. Over time, the stories of this land would grow as saturated and as dense as its forested landscape. There would be no homegoings to Virginia. There was no talking about the past. The Coles family continued to grow, generation after generation, not knowing about the significance of this land, just that it was there and that we pay monthly taxes on it. There's a reluctance in my family to talk about the darker shadows of our history. It is easier to turn a blind eye than face uglier truths that never question why my great-grandfather was born with blue eyes, or why my grandfather, Archie Coles Sr., and the current Walter Coles bear a striking resemblance. Which brings me to my Aunt Bert. She was the eldest child of Jesse and the inspiration for my story. At the start of the pandemic, I started visiting her regularly and brought her food. And each time I would visit her, we'd sit in her living room and talk. We'd catch up on the goings-on in the family and surface-level stuff. But the longer I would stay, she would start to divulge into telling me stories. And the way she'd do it is just drop these like little truth bombs out of nowhere. One minute we'd be talking about the weather, and the next she would be telling me about how our family migrated to Pittsburgh. Or we'd be watching Wheel of Fortune, and she'd mention how her younger brother died on her 10th birthday. a brother, my grandfather never, ever talked about. I realized that there were so many parts of my family history that no one knew except for this 98-year-old woman. Worse, because she was the oldest living person in my family, when she was gone, I knew that these stories would be too. So I did what any person would do. I recorded her. Every time, every minute I spent with my Aunt Bert, I documented not knowing what I would find. Over time, I realized that her stories were laden with horrors, traumas, and perseverance. The stories would be a little different each time she told them, but I also realized that these stories came with lessons. Much like with folktales, there were heatings, and it was only through the power of conversation that I would require them. So let's talk about folktales. Generally speaking, folktales originated among peasants and villagers without much formal education. These stories were shared among generations as a way of presenting everyday life lessons and useful information in an easy-to-understand format. They also help to connect listeners to common cultural values of a particular tribe, ethnic group, or culture. And as they're passed down orally, they stem from a pre-literate age, right? And today we have the option to read these folktales because of people like Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm, who in the 19th century traveled around rural Germany and Eastern Europe, collecting folktales that had never before been written down. But similarly, in the 20th century, Zora Neale Hurston traveled throughout the South to collect stories of African Americans and other folk practices. She explained this as a daunting task, which never really sat right with me. What was the function of Black folklore? Was Hurston pointing to folklore operating as this form of coping mechanism? Henry Louis Gates acknowledges that tales have been a part of African Americans' equipment for survival and sustenance. Through the transatlantic slave trade, Africans brought with them styles of worship, games, and other broader outlines of their cultural traditions and transfused them with songs and stories in order to keep these traditions alive. And Gates notes that the story types, characters, motifs, and styles of telling them bear distinctive traits. So when we're thinking about the elements of folktales, they're usually about ordinary people in everyday life. There's stories that include setting and characters and a problem, right? There's a conflict that happens. The characters are often flat. There's not a lot of depth to them, but they're portrayed as clever, right? And we see these over-exaggerations or hyperbole found in these folktales. For me, I wanted a solid formula to write about my family. And when we think about the types of folktales, we have to think about talking animals, right? There's these tales that tell why. There's tales of magic, cumulative tales, or how things became the way they are. And tales of exaggeration or legendary tales, tall tales like John Henry and Paul Bunyan being examples. But there's also these common motifs where there's wishes granted, there's a monster, there's objects that are magical, there's trickery, there's a poor person who might become rich, or the number 3 is significant, or the youngest of small siblings is successful and other families fail, where there may or may not be unwise characters. But folktales, especially when Black, stem from this vernacular tradition, and I think that's important to call attention to. And this tradition distinguishes the work in its group that's sometimes secretive or defensive or aggressive character that Hurston points out. Similar to tales from Europe, Black folktales, first and foremost, are intentional linguistic styles, where the less formal talk that you heard in the first story that I read, or in the story that I will read eventually, becomes figuratively and subversively its own form of art, which I think is so cool. When we're thinking about the formula a little more succinctly, and again, I'm framing this so that way you can kind of identify this as I'm reading, but there's a plot that starts immediately. The characters are very one-sided and flat. the plot kind of follows along this pathway where we're following along with the characters in real time. And at the end, all questions are essentially answered. For me, the thing that I love about folktale is that there's no open ending. The no ending is never really fully happy or sad. And I think that serves as a wonderful metaphor for my family's story. The fact that we've remained through the good and the bad, we've survived. So what purposes do myths serve? Myths explain how things came to be. They teach us lessons and values, and a lot of us probably have cultural significance where they identify groups and social and religious rituals. But in short, we read myths and fables to acquire a better understanding of our society. We learn about our history and we become culturally literate along the way because of folk tales and myths. Creative writers are often told that the truth of the story is what drives the narrative. We also learn that truth is subjective, which allows for embellishment. It's my belief that folktales and fables are a wonderful modality to play with these truths, where reality too can have these fantastical components. Sisi Lati Okan. Black folks talk about the magic of Gilly Cole's cauldron. White folks talk about her too. Every kind of folk claim her as kin, and there are good reasons why. Let me tell you. Once upon a time, not yours or mine, but a bygone time, some people was owned. And the owners were called master and mistress. And no matter what, the owners knew what the owned were doing, knew what time they needed to be in the fields, knew what time they were allowed to pray, knew the goings on upon the land they owned, and gave a name to everything that lived on it. Nothing ever happened without master and mistress's say so. Aunt Becky was to be married. Aunt Becky, you see, took care of master and mistress's babies, nursed them as soon as they took to their first breath, and raised them right by the time they could walk, even though she never had any of her own. By some time, master made an agreement with his neighbor that Becky could marry any man of the neighbor's choosing. Both men could make a profit in having a wedding. Becky could work on both farms, and she could make babies for master to sell. But today was Becky's day, and master said the owned could take the afternoon off to celebrate, as good Christians are wont to do. And it was going to be a fine affair. The womenfolk took Becky and made her a beautiful dress of lace. They laughed and giggled in one of the nearby cabins as they fit her for her garments. They piled her hair up and stuck it full of magpie feathers to match the dress. Some of the younger ones picked wildflowers and made Aunt Becky a crown and braided the crown with ribbons every color of the rainbow. The menfolk fashioned an altar with a garland. They built benches for the elders so they could all sit in peace. Oh, yes, it was going to be a fine affair. Gilly was master and mistress's cook, and their favorite one at that. She could make anything taste like heaven. One bite of her food, people said, and you'd never want another morsel made by hands that weren't hers. For Becky's wedding, she told herself she was going to make a feast to feed every mouth. But to do so, she knew she had to ask master and mistress first. After serving master and mistress every meal by hand, Gilly also was the one responsible for clearing their plates. After breakfast that morning, Gilly cleared their plates like always. "Another fine meal, Gilly," said master. "Another great start to the day." "Why, thank you, master and mistress. Gilly replied. And on a day like today, it's important that we all get our strength. Master sat back and rubbed his belly. Today? What's happening today? The wedding, dear, replied Mistress. Today is Becky's special day. Master, our girl is becoming a woman. Master took another sip of his coffee. Yes, thank you, wife. I completely forgot. Becky is your kin, isn't she, Gilly? Oh, yes, Gilly responded bashfully. I'd like to make a feast for the celebration. With your permission, of course. Master looked at his wife and took another sip. Mistress touched her husband's hands. Oh, please, dear. It could be a wedding present from us. Well, he started. I don't see the harm, as long as it doesn't take away from your work. Take 2 chickens from the coop. That should be more than enough to feed everyone. With that, Master waved Gilly off. She bowed to Master and Mistress and took the plates into the kitchen. 2 chickens, Gilly thought. That would nearly feed half of us. By and by, the owns came from the neighboring farm, along with Becky's promised man, Bo. With them, they brought 1 chicken and some pig guts to add to the feast. Gilly went to the coop and killed and plucked 2 chickens. She fried as much as she could and left the carcasses on the counter. Even though she had about 2 buckets of chicken, there were 50 mouths to feed. Even with the chitlins, she still needed more. Gilly went to the forest to find fresh huckleberries to pick for pies. She picked and picked till her fingers turned purple and her apron was full. On her way back to the kitchen, she saw a turtle spinning on its back. Please help me, Brer Turtle begged. Some folk done kicked me over and now I can't get up. Poor Brer Turtle, I'll help you, Gilly replied. She leaned over and with one hand turned Brer Turtle right side up. There, Gilly said. Brer Turtle smiled. He stood on his hind legs and bowed. His stomach rumbled. Oh, please help me, Brer Turtle begged. I was laying there for so long I worked up a hunger. Poor Brer Turtle, I'll help you, Gilly replied. Gilly reached into her apron and handed the turtle some berries she was saving. There, Brer Turtle grabbed the berries and stuffed them into his beak. When he was done, he bowed again. Well, thank you, kind woman. You helped me. Now, what can I do for you? Oh, I don't want for nothing. Just want to make a feast for my kin's wedding. I'm surely worried that I won't have enough food to feed everyone, especially now that I gave you all them berries. Brer Turtle took off his shell. Take this. Put this and some bones into a pot. It'll make the finest soup you've ever tasted. Better yet, every time you spoon some out, more will fill in the pot in its place. Gilly took the turtle's shell. Why, thank you. Brer Turtle bowed, and with that he walked away. Gilly ripped some of her dress and made a knapsack for the shell. She continued to walk towards the farm till she found a rabbit with a foot in his trap. Please help me, Brer Rabbit begged. Some men done tricked me and now I can't get out. Poor Brer Rabbit, I'll help you, Gilly replied. Gilly leaned over and with one hand untied the string around Brer Rabbit's foot. There. Brer Rabbit stood on his hind legs and bowed. His stomach rumbled. Please help me, Brer Rabbit begged. I was laying there for so long I done worked up a hunger. Poor Brer Rabbit, I'll help you, Gilly replied. Gilly reached into her apron and handed Brer Rabbit the last of her berries she was saving. There. Brer Rabbit grabbed the berries and stuffed them into his mouth. When he was done, he bowed again. Well, thank you, kind woman. You helped me. Now, what can I do for you? Oh, I don't want for nothing. Just want to make a feast for my kin's wedding. I'm surely worried that I won't have enough food to feed everyone, especially now that I gave you the last of my berries. I was going to make some pies. Brer Rabbit smiled and hopped over to a sage bush. He gathered up the branches, whispered into his paws, and handed them to Gilly. Take this. If you put these and some apples into some dough, it'll make the finest cake you've ever tasted. Better yet, every time you cut a slice, more will fill on the plate in its place. Gilly took the sage and put it into her apron. Why, thank you. Brer Rabbit bowed, and with that he hopped away. Time was cutting close, and Gilly still had work to do. She continued back towards the farm to cook as she was told. First, she made the stew. She took the Brer Turtle's shell and threw the chicken bones into the pot and filled it with water. She added some salt and pepper, some vegetables, and sure enough, just like Brer Turtle had promised, the stew became thick and overflowing with chicken and turtle meat. Then she made the cake. She went to the apple orchard and picked the juiciest and reddest apples she could find. She sliced the fruit and took the sage and folded it into the batter. She put the cake pan into the oven. Just like Brer Rabbit had promised, out came the biggest and sweetest smelling cake Gilly had ever seen. She covered the cake with brown sugar and put it back in the oven to glaze. When the cake and the stew were done, Gilly asked the menfolk to carry the food outside. People say Aunt Becky's wedding was the best affair, said it for years to come. Becky and Bo jumped the broom. When they crossed, Becky hugged her cousin and took the magpie feathers and put them in Gilly's hair. People danced and ate until their bellies were full. For one full day, they forgot they was owned, and it was a fine feast indeed. Batter up. Come here, my mother instructs. Lean in close over the stove. I walk over to the cast iron skillet. The warmth of the Crisco mixed with butter smells salt and sweet. The sizzle, the crackling whispers of the chicken reverberate through me. I hear the pop and back away before the oil catches on my skin and clothes. That, my mother says, half smiling, is how you know the chicken is done. My family's love language has always been food. My earliest memory of fried chicken is at grandmother's house on Sundays. Her thin, frail forearm turned chicken with a fork. Each piece was always golden to perfection, as if it came from the store. The battered skin crunched between my teeth and burned the roof of my mouth. She'd call me pretty miss and stroke my forehead. Later, in bed together, I would snuggle up next to her under the comforter as she cross-stitched her next masterpiece and watch David Letterman. I would fall asleep to the sound of her teeth against the flesh of a wing hidden in a napkin. That was my lullaby, the crunch of my grandmother's teeth. Her dentures against bone were my white noise. After my grandmother's passing, my mother still made fried chicken on Sundays. She'd stand over the same cast iron pan that was once her mother's and turn the chicken occasionally with a fork. As she fried, she'd have me wash and clean collard greens mixed with kale. Together over the hot stove of boiling ham hocks and the sizzling serenade of frying poultry, we'd dance and sing to Stevie Wonder. Isn't she lovely? Isn't she made from God? In my mother's kitchen, there was home. There was warmth. There was comfort. Together in the kitchen, my mother taught me the alchemy of my ancestry that my grandmother had taught to her. Historically, most fried chicken recipes come from Black women. These were your mammies and your house cooks, the women who, after they were no longer enslaved, stayed to bring their former enslavers warm meals out of pity and misplaced loyalty. These are the women who became entrepreneurs and sold their fried chicken at train stations and at roadside stands for white people passing by. They were the ones whose recipes were stolen, altered, and circulated into fast food chains. I think about this every time I see a Popeyes commercial. The way a Black woman on the TV legitimizes the fact that a white man from Louisiana started a fried chicken franchise. I think about Miss Childress, the Black woman who sold her recipe to Colonel Sanders for a measly $1,200. I wonder how many stories we've never heard. I wonder how many battles are lost before they exit Black women's kitchens. When it comes to fried chicken, I too have battled with white men. With time, tinkering, and temperance, my fried chicken recipe, my ability to cook, it came with a sense of pride. With each batch mixed with seasoned salt and pepper, I perfected my mother's alchemy into a new creation. Old Bay for my Maryland upbringing, a bit of honey whisked with egg and buttermilk to soak my meat in. But no matter what seasonings I use, the process is always as my mother taught me. It comes in astral whisper over my shoulder. Fill a plastic grocery bag with seasonings and flour. Shake till chicken is covered. Put it on a plate. Check if the oil is hot enough. Drip a bit of water on it from the faucet. Flick's hand. If it crackles, then throw in that bird. Once you hear the chicken pop, you'll know it's done. Put it in a bowl. Make sure there's paper towel lining to catch the drippings. Otherwise, you'll have soggy chicken. In grad school, there was a friendly fried chicken cook-off between me and some friends. It was a battle royale where over stovetops and deep fryers, Nicole, biracial but Black, and Johnny, a white boy from West Virginia, and I competed to see who the ultimate chicken fryer was. We had a panel of judges. We had our respective corners. Johnny was even nice enough to supply the chicken. Moving to some consanguineous rhythm, I channel my mother's process. Plastic bag, seasonings, flour. But then, as the oil warmed and the bag was prepped and buttermilk was poured into the bowl, I noticed that the only chicken Johnny had left to use was boneless and skinless breasts. Boneless, skinless breasts. I did the best with what I had. I poked holes into the chicken to let the buttermilk seep in. I shook the meat in the plastic bag with seasoning and flour a little longer and harder. When the chicken was done frying, we put our creations on a plate before the three judges. Then I noticed Johnny's plate. A leg, 2 wings, and 1 thigh. Naturally, Johnny won the competition. I came in second and Nicole third. I was shocked that my recipe, a recipe passed down through generations, lost. I felt like an embarrassment to my ancestors. A recipe I had worked so hard to perfect meant nothing in comparison to a white man's meal. I made a meal that had been judged. It was rendered less than. With time, I learned to forgive myself. I realized that I was never meant to win. Not really. The cook-off was my first lesson on privilege. It was learning how to take the leftovers of a white man and make do with what was given. It was the same song and story of my ancestors. I was born into a world where my people made masterpieces of pig knuckles and intestines. Historically, chicken is a staple in many Black families as it was a cheap way to feed the enslaved. Sundays were the only days in which slaves were allowed to spend some modicum of leisure with family, and on these days, fried chicken was often made. There is a sense of ownership that comes from fried chicken, a sense of pride, that the same meals that sustained my preceding lineage still continue to feed my family. I can make greens, Hoppin' John on New Year's, and sweet potato pie, but my fried chicken is the staple that tethers me to my Black kin. My great-great-great-grandmother, Gilly Coles, was an enslaved cook. Day in and day out, she fed the white folk and nourished their stomachs. How many tears did Gilly cough back over stirred pots? How many kitchen floors did my grandmother scrub on bruised knees? I think about this every time I cook for white friends and loved ones. I cook as an act of love, and yet sometimes I worry that all of the work of my foremothers was in vain. On those days where I sweat over steaming pots of collard greens, a double consciousness unveils. I am doing exactly what they were forced to do. I am no better than a mammy. I am no better than a coon. I am stereotype incarnate. Some days, though, being a stereotype is both beautiful and bittersweet. The day that it was announced that Kamala Harris would be the first woman and person of color as the 49th Vice President of the United States, Nicole and I celebrated. Twerking to Beyonce and flipping our natural hair around us, we danced in jubilee at the possibilities that Black girls like us could be magical. It didn't matter if we witnessed countless Black lives being snuffed out in the year of plague of racism and ignorance. It didn't matter that the pandemic forced us all into isolation or challenged us to question what value relationships held in our lives. In that moment, all that mattered was that we had survived in spite of a system designed for girls like Nicole and I to fail. Over Nicole's cast iron skillet, the chicken sizzled while waffles cooked to a perfect golden crust. Braless in our pajamas, we tossed back Jell-O shots and sang Who Runs the World in Diva. Beyonce reminded us why Black women are the epitome of excellence. I flipped the chicken with a fork. I listened for the pop. When the food was done, we plated our beautiful meals and sat on Nicole's couch. Nicole turned to me and smiled. I love us, she sighed, pouring maple syrup over our plate. I know, I replied. We are pretty great. In that moment, it didn't matter how problematic the world was, is, and will always be. It was just another Sunday. I often think about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Dangers of a Single Story TED Talk, where she says that stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. In thinking about the operations of Black folk tales, perhaps new narratives around Black life and its histories can be written outside of these monolithic myths. One of the things I am asked about when I talk about this project is why I decided to use folktale as a model to write stories about my family. The fact remains that these stories are not necessarily mine to tell. The embellishments I took were in respect to the story my family was reluctant to divulge. At the start of my own project, I soon realized that there was a swath of folktales from various cultures that did not necessarily, fit the aesthetic of my book. And so I had to create my own. My favorite quote by the late author and genius, Toni Morrison, says, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And so I say this to you. If there's a story that hasn't been told, then you must be the griot to tell it. As creative writers, as human beings, it's our responsibility to record the truths of this world that not all are willing to speak on. Be the one to speak truth into your power, as there is power in the tongue. Thank you so much for listening.
That was absolutely wonderful, Caitlyn. Now, everybody, if you have any questions for Caitlyn, just go ahead and type them into the chat or into the Q&A section. We'll find them no matter what. But I wanted to tell you that this was an amazing book to read. I wanted to say, with the folktales, and for those of you who haven't had the joy of reading this yet, she goes back and forth in the narrative, and you are so brave in telling a lot of your own stories in here, your own truths, and not all of them are easy. And I found that bravery really compelling. And how did your family react to some of these truths? Because some of them were difficult.
Yeah, it's funny you asked that, right? Because my MFA is in creative nonfiction, so I had to, for my master's thesis, I wrote a lot about my late teens and early 20s. And I remember showing a transcript to my mother, and she looked at me and she was like, "Who are you?" And so it was interesting writing this piece, because the folktale I read initially, I actually shared with my Aunt Bert in the early stages, and she printed it out and kept it next to her. And it was like one of these, and it was written about her father, my great grandfather Jesse. And that for me was like all the validation that I needed. I didn't care about whatever what other family members said, but they've all been really receptive and so proud of it. And it's funny talking to them, because a lot of the characters in the folktale aspect are still alive. And so to talk to them about the things they're reading about themselves has been really fun. And they've now divulged more stories. So never be afraid to ask the hard questions in family. You never know what comes of it. And in my case, it's so much creative value and treasure.
There were so many stories that I thought were interesting. And for those of you who don't know, Caitlyn did come to Sotterley when she was younger. That part is in the book. And it was at a very different point in Sotterley's history that she was there. And the honesty with which we're telling stories was not what she encountered. And not what the other children were. They weren't kind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they're, trying to not only look at the past, but look at how we should be, or how we could be. And there were, like I said, many things that you talked about that were interesting. But I wondered, with the folk tales, were these particular folk tales ones that your family told that were handed down to you? Were they ones that you encountered in your reading? Where did the folk tales come from?
That's a great question. It was kind of a both and, especially with talking to my Aunt Bert. There's a story, a folktale called Birdie and the Bear, which is directly about her being in this domestic violent situation with her first husband. And the way that she literally would describe him in recounting these moments was calling him a bear. And so it became, and my Aunt Bert, her full name is Birdie. So it was interesting to hear the ways in which she would embellish certain truths in that story. And then finding out that after talking to other relatives, that there were other facets to it, right? And the stories never necessarily gelled together in the ways that felt like a very cohesive narrative. Another thing that inspired me, Zora Neale Hurston has this book called Mules and Men, where it is literally all of the folk tales that she, in voodoo practices that she collected in her journeys down south. And there's this really cool folk tale about John and the flood, where it talks about this guy. He dies in this major catastrophe. He's in heaven trying to complain about this flood. And then you realize, as I was reading it, it was about the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania. And so it was this really interesting way of capturing an historical event that was a major catastrophe in this way that almost was painted as a myth. And in doing so, I think about like the value of what that significance of that moment held within the Black community, and people still don't necessarily talk about, but they will tell the John and the flood story. And so in the same way, folktale, especially in thinking about my family's stories, was a way of preserving those memories in a way that, I can tell my future children and be like, instead of saying, hey, my mother went to Africa and met this griot who told her that, or this, for lack of a better word, a witch doctor told her that she was going to have a successful child. I can come up with this whole story of a woman wanting to go to Africa and coming back with this egg. And think about like, what does that do symbolically, but also in terms of thinking about our own identity and like what significance that moment had for both my mother and myself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Absolutely, it does. I found them fascinating because I wasn't sure if some of these were sometimes things are taken down and adapted. I've seen stories that came from one particular culture, and then you'll see it pop up and like, that sounds familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes you see those kinds of stories repeated, but there's usually a deep underlying truth that's trying to come through.
Oh yeah, for sure. And there are certain things I borrow from folktale tropes, like the Wendell and the Devil story, like people versus the devil are those crossword themes are pretty prevalent in Black folktales. The master slave folktales where the slave is the trickster figure often come up. And even Brer Rabbit, I'm actually teaching an African-American lit class, and my students are reading folktales next week, and they're reading a Brer Rabbit story. And so I think that there's a really interesting way of bridging myth in this very contemporary lens, where there's still that significance, right? Like as a young woman growing up with like the era of Disney movies, right? Those all come from old folktales, and thinking about how they tackle themes of gender and things of access and privilege, and also thinking about what does it mean to be a Black Disney princess, right? Has been really fun to kind of interrogate in these ways that feel salient with what's going on culturally and historically for me. But yeah, it's been a really fun way of also trying to unpack generational trauma in a way that feels very salient, because in a lot of Black families, they don't want to talk about those harder truths. I had no idea that we owned land on a plantation until my grandfather was much, much older. It was always referred to as a farm. And so even in that telling of something that's very important, there's that myth attached to it.
Yeah, we have heard that so many of our descendants have talked about the fact that they weren't hearing things from their family. There are a couple of questions. One from Mariana said that this has been wonderful. Of course, there's a lot of those comments going on right now. So, but interested in your bio, what are you seeking to learn through your studies at Duquesne?
So right now, my dissertation focuses on Black women and food, as it was kind of inspired by this book. I've been really interested in learning more about my foremothers and their relationship to food and the stories that were attached to it. When I moved back to Southern Maryland about almost 2 years ago, I did a road trip with my dad where we actually went to Chatham, Virginia, and I got to walk the land. I got to meet some very distant relatives. I actually saw the big house that's still there. And I also did a lot of food tours as well. And it was just, there's something very powerful about learning where the recipes you've cooked and are so deeply ingrained that they're almost like, it feels like, riding a bike, to know where that origin story comes from. And I think a lot about the fact that there isn't a lot documented about Gilly Coles, and I have questions. And so I think a lot of us have questions about our foremothers. And for me, food was a very helpful navigating resource to kind of unpack that. So right now I'm focusing on thinking about what a culinary memoir is, especially as it pertains to Black women, who many of which were illiterate. And, it's only been within the past 2 or 3 generations of a lot of Black families where literacy was kind of expected. And so it's interesting when I talk to older relatives where they're like, oh, I don't know anything about cooking, but you need to get a pot and some cinnamon and all of these things. And I have to literally write it down. And so I see a lot of overlap about how the oral tradition is so deeply ingrained in a lot of the ways in which I understand Black lived experience.
Well, we have another question from somebody missed so much. Rose, I haven't seen you forever. She has a question for you. How do you personally handle walking the tightrope of giving a truthful nonfiction account of history, your history too, and incorporating invented elements of your own? Do you try to model your mythological folkloric elements after existing fables and myths, or do you have the freedom to work outside of those established stories and tropes?
This is a very interesting question because it's a both and for me. There's this wonderful anthology of Black folk tales. Thanks, shout out mom, thanks mom, for buying it for me. But it has like hundreds and hundreds of. It's like the biggest collection I've ever seen. And so when I knew I had an idea of what I wanted to write. Like I said, the first folktale I wrote, I literally just came off the cuff. There was no format or formula attached to it. I really wanted to be intentional about adhering to what had already existed in Black folktales, but making it something new and different. So like I said, there's certain characters or themes that I do try to stay pretty honest to. But I think what's really interesting, especially with my own family and things I've read as an African-American literature scholar, there are a lot of moments in Black lived experiences that come up, right? Like, especially in the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of Black women writers focused on domestic violence. A lot of women were domestics, right? And thinking about, there was a lot of pain. I often teach Raisin in the Sun, which not only looks at pain, but thinks about poverty and thinks about upward mobility. And those are all things that are indicative of my own family story. So it felt really, I always feel weird about saying this word, but it felt easy to kind of slip in between the margins of folktale to tell a story that was not only just relatable, but also deeply personal. Oh, I can't hear you, Nancy.
Nancy, I think you might be muted.
I'm talking away because somebody, my husband, is making noise in the background. So I was trying to spare you all from that. So sorry. But there are some wonderful comments going on in the chat. There are also some wonderful writers in the chat. Meredith Taylor, who's going to be having a talk with us with her new book coming up this summer, loves the fact that you mixed folk tales and memoir. And that's just it. And the ties are wonderful. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, though some of them have, and I can see that in the chat, your lessons are, don't forget where you came from. You don't always get to pick and choose your battles. Isn't that true? Love will find you even in the dark. Persevere and lay the groundwork for others. And I loved that chapter. Feed your mind to nourish your soul. You are the amalgamation of your genealogy. You are stardust reimagined. Dream for the cosmos and listen to whispers and allow them to guide you. And each chapter you migrate back and forth between the two. Did you have in your mind these chapters, or did the chapters just evolve?
Oh, they totally evolved. It was a lot of the personal essays were some things that I wrote in grad school, but also things that were happening in the moment that I just kind of went back to and reshaped. But all of the folk tales just kind of spoke to me. And it was one of those things where I had to really think about, okay, how many of these, like, what were the stories that are commonly told to me? Like the little Skippy and the ghost story is something my Aunt Carol tells me all the time. I literally can't go a year without hearing this story. But the way in which she tells it to me is always in different ways. Like be it like if I'm leaning into my sixth sense, or thinking about like communing with the ancestors, or even just like how to take care of yourself when you're sick, or trusting being in a relationship. And I think that those stories had a purpose, even though the storytellers didn't necessarily know what that purpose was in the moment. And I think that growing up with those really helped shape me who I am. The lessons that you, thank you for naming them. And it's interesting to hear you read them, because I didn't really go in with this idea of lessons until I realized, like, oh, these folktales, like that's the whole purpose of them. And I realized that there were these themes that were happening that I really had to name. And it's interesting to hear them all side by side, because they're almost like mantras in terms of how to go forward and find power and empowerment. And that's what this whole project was for me, is just finding empowerment in who I am and who are the people that really shape me into that person.
I found one of the things that was so compelling is that you showed sides of yourself, of course, that most people who know you would never have imagined, or just even inner turmoils that have been faced, that in day-to-day life and the choices of who you date, how you live, what you do, that there are lenses that are there. There's people are not always going through what you see on the outside. And you showed us what was on the inside, and an inside that many people wouldn't have glimpsed. And there was a reality when I was in a meeting the other day, and we were talking about a place that everybody really liked. And she just said very quietly, well, I kind of have a different feeling, because when I went into this area, I wasn't allowed to try on the clothes when I went there when I was younger. And again, just because something looks a certain way that you see it, we take it now. Sometimes there are other realities we need to be aware of. And even though some of these stories you hear from people who are older than you are, because you're still young, but people are still going through things, and families are still going through them. And the fact that you shared these and mix them with the fables was just fabulous.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. There's one more question. I tend to be an ebook reader because I'm on the move so often. Will Power in the Tongue have an ebook version, or is there one available somewhere?
Well, there is currently not. The book is through a small indie press, so they don't necessarily do ebooks, but hopefully one day it might get transferred over. I'm sure I'm not the only artist that's asked them. But it is a very light read. It's easily fits in a purse. I can attest to it. I've done it many times. It might even fit in a fanny pack, who knows?
It's the kind of book that I can read again and again. I'm going to find something I didn't see the first time, and it will be wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Caitlyn, for sharing yourself and your story with us. By the way, maybe you need to do an audiobook, because it's very compelling when you read it. So you might have to do that version too. You'll just have to do a lot of different versions. But I hope more and more people, I just have to get so many more copies of these made, because this is a wonderful way to share your history, your truth, but your family's history and the genealogy and your background, your perspectives. It was absolutely magical. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here, Nancy. It's been a dream, and I'm so honored to be here.
We were thrilled to have you. This was a wonderful way to kick off 2024. I tell you, this is just absolutely fabulous. Next month, we're also going to have a virtual presentation, so you can join us from anywhere once again. It's going to be on April 10th. It's going to be a panel discussion, how far we have come and where do we need to go. And for those of you who don't know, this is the declared by Maryland as the year to honor civil rights, because it's the 60-year anniversary. So some of the topics we'll be talking about in next month's panel on April 10th will be about that. So we hope you join us. Caitlyn, you were wonderful. To all of you who joined us, thank you so much. If you are already members of our Sotterley family, thank you. If you're interested in becoming a member and joining the family or volunteering or being part of it, reach out. We'd love to have you. This was an honor. Thank you so much. Thank you, Caitlyn. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Oh, there we go.